Still, when everyone in the lobby had already frozen in place, a man in a $3,000 suit stood behind his glass desk, with his hands trembling so hard he could not pick up his own phone. A security guard was shouting into his radio. A woman from accounting had dropped her coffee and did not even notice it spreading across the marble floor. A small boy in a faded blue hoodie was standing in the middle of the executive lobby, with his 3-year-old brother going limp in his arms. The boy's name was Eli. He was 10 years old. His little brother's lips had already turned the color of a bruise. Eli had counted 11 seconds since Micah stopped making the wheezing sound and started making no sound at all, and 11 seconds felt like the longest measurement of time a 10-year-old had ever been asked to hold in his chest. Before we go any further, if you believe that courage does not care how old you are and that a shaking hand can still reach for something worth saving, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that people are still capable of showing up for each other. Now, back to the story. Eli had walked into the 52nd floor of Sterling Tower that evening, the same way he had walked in almost every evening for the past year, quietly along the service hallway, past the cleaning carts, holding his little brother's hand, because there was nowhere else for either of them to be. Their mother, Renata, worked the 7 o'clock to midnight shift as part of the cleaning crew that came through after the office workers went home. She could not afford a sitter. She could not afford daycare that stayed open past 6. So on the nights when her sister could not watch the boys, Eli and Micah came with her, and they sat in the small break room on the 52nd floor, the one with the vending machine that ate quarters and the window that looked out over a city neither of them had ever really gotten to enjoy in daylight. Eli always brought a backpack. Inside it was a coloring book for Micah, 2 granola bars, a bottle of water, and a small spiral notebook, where Eli had, over the last 8 months, copied down every piece of medical information he could get his hands on about Micah's condition. Micah had a severe tree nut allergy, the kind doctors called anaphylaxis risk, the kind that came with a red folder full of instructions that Eli had read so many times the corners had gone soft. Eli was not a doctor. Eli was not even supposed to understand half of what was written in that folder, but Eli had made it his responsibility to understand it anyway, because he had learned a long time ago that in his family, being the oldest meant being the one who paid attention when the adults were too tired to. That evening had started like any other. Renata had settled the boys in the break room with strict instructions not to touch anything from the shared snack basket that some kind office worker had left out for the cleaning staff because office snack baskets were unpredictable and unlabeled, and Micah's allergy did not forgive unpredictable things. Eli had understood. Eli always understood. But Micah was 3, and 3-year-olds do not fully understand the difference between a granola bar with chocolate chips and a granola bar with crushed walnuts pressed into the same wrapper. And while Eli was distracted for less than 2 minutes helping his mother carry a stack of paper towels down the hall, Micah had reached into the basket. By the time Eli came back into the room, Micah's face was already blotching red. Within 90 seconds, his lips were swelling. Within 3 minutes, he was struggling to pull air into lungs that were closing faster than his small body could fight against. Eli had seen a mild reaction before, a rash, some hives, medicine, and a scared hour at urgent care. He had never seen this. This was the version of the red folder that the doctors called the worst case, the version Eli had read about but never watched happen in front of him. Eli did not scream. He would later not be able to explain why he did not scream, except to say that somewhere in the last 8 months of reading and rereading that folder, some part of him had understood that screaming would cost time, and time was the only thing standing between his brother and something Eli refused to let himself finish thinking about. He grabbed Micah, he grabbed his backpack, and he ran. He did not know where the nearest hospital was. He did not know his mother's exact location on the cleaning route that night. What he knew, because he had overheard it from the security guard who liked to chat with his mother during her breaks, was that there was a company nurses' station on the top floor, the executive floor, the floor where the man who owned the entire building sometimes worked past midnight. Eli did not know the man's name. He did not know what a CEO was exactly. Beyond understanding, it meant someone important. All he knew was that the top floor was the only place in the building he had ever heard described as having real medical supplies, and his brother did not have time for Eli to be wrong about anything else. He ran up 4 flights of stairs because the elevator felt too slow to trust, carrying his brother the entire way, his arms burning, his own breath coming in ragged gasps that almost matched his brother's failing ones. When he finally reached the top floor, he did not know that he had just walked directly into the private office of Nathaniel Cross, the founder and chief executive of Cross Sterling Holdings, one of the largest logistics and shipping conglomerates on the eastern seaboard. A man who had built an empire out of moving other people's goods across the world with such precision that not one of his competitors could explain how he did it so efficiently. What Eli also did not know, because there was no way for a 10-year-old boy who cleaned break rooms after hours to know it, was that 3 years earlier, Nathaniel Cross had lost his own son. The boy's name had been Theo. He had been 4 years old. He had eaten a piece of birthday cake at a friend's party that had been cross-contaminated with almond flour, a detail so small that the caterer had not even thought to mention it, a detail so small that it had taken the ambulance 11 minutes to arrive, 11 minutes that had felt, to Nathaniel, like the entire remaining length of his life compressed into a single unbearable stretch of time. Theo had not survived. Nathaniel had. Since that day, Nathaniel Cross had become a man who built things instead of felt things. He had thrown himself into work with a ferocity that his board of directors quietly admired, and his ex-wife quietly grieved, because she had watched her husband replace a son with quarterly earnings reports and had eventually understood that some men do not know how to sit inside their own pain, so they build walls of spreadsheets around it instead. He kept an EpiPen in his desk drawer, not because he expected to need it, but because for 3 years he had not been able to make himself remove it, the way some people cannot make themselves delete a voicemail from someone who is gone. He had never used it. He had never needed to. Until the night his office door burst open, and a boy he had never met stood in front of him holding a toddler whose face looked exactly, precisely, unbearably like the face Nathaniel had held in his own arms 3 years earlier, in a hospital corridor that had smelled like antiseptic and had ended in the worst sentence a doctor can say to a parent. "Sir," Eli said, his voice shaking but clear, "my little brother can't breathe." Nathaniel Cross stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the window behind him. He looked at the boy, he looked at the toddler, and then something in him that had been locked for 3 years cracked open all at once, and his hands, the same hands that had signed billion-dollar shipping contracts without a flicker of hesitation, began to shake so hard he could not get his desk drawer open on the first try. Eli did not know any of this. Eli only knew that the important-looking man behind the desk had gone pale and was fumbling with a drawer handle like his fingers had forgotten how fingers worked, and that his little brother's chest was moving less and less with every passing second. So Eli did the only thing he knew how to do. He set Micah down gently on the small couch against the wall, tilted his head back the way the red folder had shown in careful, labeled diagrams, and said, in a voice far steadier than any 10-year-old should have to find inside himself, "The pen goes in his leg, sir, the outside of his thigh. I've read it. I know where it goes. I just need you to open the drawer." Something about hearing a child recite the exact protocol that Nathaniel himself had once been too devastated to remember in time broke through the paralysis. His hands were still shaking, but his mind, the part of him that had built an empire out of solving impossible logistics problems under pressure, finally caught up to the moment. He got the drawer open, he got the EpiPen out, and because his hands would not stop trembling enough to trust himself, he knelt down, looked at Eli, and said the words that would later be the only part of that night Eli would ever describe as feeling like being trusted by an adult for the first time in his life. "I can't hold steady enough. Guide my hand." Eli did. Small fingers wrapped around a grown man's shaking wrist, steadying it the way he had steadied his own hands 100 times, practicing with a pretend pen on a stuffed animal, because some quiet, careful part of him had once thought, what if someday I actually need to know this? The needle went in exactly where it needed to go. 10 seconds passed. Then Micah's chest heaved, a real breath, ragged and desperate and beautiful, the kind of sound that Nathaniel Cross had spent 3 years wishing he could have heard one more time from a different small boy in a different room. He called for an ambulance himself, his voice finally steady again, and stayed on the floor beside both boys until the paramedics arrived, one hand resting lightly on Micah's back, feeling him breathe, unable to look away, because for the first time in 3 years, watching a small child breathe in front of him did not feel like a wound being reopened. It felt like something being allowed to heal, even slightly, even just for that moment. Before we continue, we want to pause here, because what Nathaniel did in that room is only half of this story. The other half belongs to the people who made it possible for a 10-year-old boy to know exactly what to do, in the worst moment of his life. 8 months earlier, a school nurse named Marisol had noticed Eli sitting alone during recess, reading a laminated allergy protocol sheet that was meant for staff, not students, and instead of taking it away from him, she had sat down next to him and explained every line of it, because she believed that a child who wanted to understand how to protect his brother deserved an adult willing to teach him properly instead of shooing him off. A pediatric nurse named Dominic, who Renata had met during one of Micah's early hospital visits, had spent 20 unpaid minutes after his shift showing Eli exactly where the outer thigh muscle was and how an EpiPen mechanism worked, because he had seen the fear in a 10-year-old's eyes and recognized that fear responds better to knowledge than to being told not to worry. None of these people were in that office that night. All of them were. Nathaniel Cross rode in the ambulance with the family, not because anyone asked him to, but because he found that he could not make himself walk away. At the hospital, while Micah was stabilized and monitored, he sat in the waiting room with Eli, still in his $3,000 suit, still shaken, and for the first time in 3 years, he told a stranger about Theo. He told Eli about the birthday cake, about the 11 minutes, about the drawer in his desk that he had never been able to empty. Eli listened the way children sometimes listen better than adults do, without trying to fix anything, without saying the wrong, comforting thing, just present, just there. When Renata arrived at the hospital, frantic, still in her cleaning uniform, having been told only that there had been an emergency, she found her son safe, and she found a man she had passed in hallways for over a year without ever really being seen by, sitting beside her oldest son with red-rimmed eyes, thanking him in a voice that did not sound like it belonged to someone who ran a company with 12,000 employees. What followed over the next several weeks was not framed by Nathaniel as charity, and Renata would not have accepted it if it had been. It began with a simple question, the same kind of question Nathaniel wished someone had once been able to ask him during the worst weeks of his own life. He asked Renata what she needed to stop working nights. He asked Eli what he wanted to learn if learning were not something he had to steal in stolen minutes between chores and stairwells. Eli, without hesitation, said he wanted to understand medicine properly, not from a laminated sheet stolen from a nurse's desk, but really, all the way, so that he would never again have to guess whether he was remembering the protocol correctly, while someone he loved turned blue in his arms. Nathaniel Cross had spent 3 years building an empire that ran flawlessly and healed nothing. He decided, in the weeks that followed, to build something that could heal something instead. He set up an education fund, not just for Eli, but structured as a foundation in Theo's name, aimed specifically at children who had been forced by circumstance to become the emergency response system for their own families, children like Eli, who had learned first aid not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Renata was moved into a daytime facilities coordinator role with actual benefits, one that let her be home in the evenings for the first time in years. Eli was enrolled in a school with an early health sciences program, and Nathaniel, without ever making it feel like a transaction, made sure that every piece of support came with the same quiet message. This is not pity. This is recognition of something in you worth investing in. 4 years passed. Eli, now 14, had become the kind of student that teachers described in the careful, impressed tone reserved for kids who ask questions that make adults pause before answering. He volunteered at the same hospital where Micah had been stabilized that night, shadowing the pediatric emergency team on weekends, not performing anything dramatic, simply learning the way he always had, quietly and completely. Micah, now 7, carried his own EpiPen in a small case that Eli had personally decorated for him, and had long since stopped being afraid of the word allergy, because his older brother had made sure he understood his own body instead of just fearing it. Nathaniel Cross visited the family often, not as a patron checking on an investment, but the way a person visits people who have become, without either side quite planning it, something close to family. His relationship with his ex-wife had softened in a way neither of them had expected, both of them finding, separately, that watching 2 boys grow up safe and cared for gave them something to feel gently, quietly grateful for again. He still kept an EpiPen in his desk drawer. He had never removed it. But now, beside it, he kept a photograph Eli had drawn for him in the weeks after that night. A crude, sincere crayon drawing of 2 boys and a man standing in an office, with the words, "Thank you for opening the drawer," written underneath in a 10-year-old's careful handwriting. The night before Eli's first day of a summer research internship at a children's hospital, arranged not through pity, but through the merit of an application he had written entirely himself, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote 3 letters. He wrote to Marisol, the school nurse who had sat with him at recess instead of taking away a laminated sheet meant for adults. He wrote to Dominic, the pediatric nurse who had spent 20 unpaid minutes after a long shift teaching a scared child where a muscle was located. And he wrote to Nathaniel, though by then Nathaniel was less a letter's distant recipient and more someone who would be at the dinner table the following week. But Eli wrote it anyway because he wanted it written down, not just spoken. Marisol wrote back within days, saying she had shown dozens of students that same laminated sheet over the years, and that Eli's letter was the first time she had ever learned what happened to one of them afterward. Dominic wrote back with a photograph of himself in scrubs from that same year, saying he still kept it on his badge lanyard as a reminder of why the unpaid 20 minutes always mattered more than the shift ending on time. Nathaniel did not write back. He simply came over that weekend, sat across from Eli at the same kitchen table, and told him that reading the letter was the first time in years he had cried, without also feeling like the crying was going to break him. In the months that followed, Nathaniel Cross found himself doing something he had not done in years, something small that nobody at the company noticed at first. He started leaving the office before dark at least twice a week. He started eating dinner at an actual table instead of at his desk between conference calls. His assistant, a woman named Priya who had worked for him for 9 years and had quietly worried about him every single one of those years, mentioned once to a colleague that the man who used to schedule meetings until 11 at night had started asking, for the first time since she had known him, what time school let out. He did not talk about it publicly. He did not want the foundation, named after his son, to become a headline about his own healing, because he believed, correctly, that the story was never supposed to be about him. But those closest to him noticed the difference in small ways. He laughed more easily. He stopped flinching at birthday parties. He kept a second EpiPen in his car now. Not because Theo needed it anymore, but because he had learned that being prepared for the people you love is not a wound. It is a form of love that does not stop just because someone is gone. Eli's growth over those 4 years did not happen in a straight line, the way it never really does for anyone. There were setbacks. In his first year at his new school, he struggled to make friends, uncertain how to explain to classmates who had never worried about rent why he sometimes flinched at loud noises, or why he kept a small first aid kit in his backpack long after Micah's condition had stabilized under proper care. A guidance counselor named Mr. Ferris noticed him eating lunch alone in the science hallway during his second week, and instead of pushing him toward the cafeteria, simply sat down next to him and asked what he was reading. It was a library book about the human immune system, dense and far above grade level, and Mr. Ferris, rather than being surprised, asked him question after question about it, genuinely curious, until Eli realized that being smart about something other kids his age were not interested in did not have to mean being alone. Mr. Ferris started a lunchtime science club that fall, technically for the whole grade, but everyone who was there in the first few weeks understood, without anyone saying it directly, that it existed because one teacher had noticed one lonely, brilliant kid and decided to build him a room to belong in. By the following spring, the club had 11 regular members, and Eli, for the first time since he could remember, had something that felt like a group of friends who liked him for exactly who he was, rather than out of sympathy for what he had been through. Micah, meanwhile, was growing up in a household that Eli had once only been able to imagine from the outside looking in. He had his own room now, with a nightlight shaped like a rocket that Renata had bought him during their first month in the new apartment. Nathaniel's foundation had helped secure an apartment with a real kitchen and a lock on the door that worked, and a landlord who returned phone calls. Micah did not remember much about the night in the executive office. He was too young. What he remembered instead, what he would remember for the rest of his life, was a big brother who always checked labels before handing him snacks, who taught him at 5 years old how to recognize the tingling feeling in his mouth that meant something was wrong, and who never once, in all the years that followed, made him feel like his allergy was something to be ashamed of or afraid of. Eli had turned his own fear into Micah's confidence, one patient explanation at a time. Renata, for her part, had spent the first several months after that night waiting, almost instinctively, for the other shoe to drop. She had grown up learning that generosity from powerful people usually came with strings, that kindness with no clear angle was the kind of thing you should be suspicious of rather than grateful for. It took nearly a year of watching Nathaniel show up consistently, of watching him ask about her son's school progress without ever once bringing up money as a topic, of watching him sit through an entire Saturday afternoon teaching Eli how to change a tire simply because Eli had asked him how cars worked, before she finally let herself believe that this was not a transaction she needed to brace herself against. She still worked hard. She still valued her own independence fiercely, insisting on paying for groceries herself, long after she technically no longer had to worry about affording them. But she allowed herself, slowly, to stop waiting for the moment when the kindness would be revealed as conditional, because it never was. By Eli's 14th birthday, the family that gathered around the small backyard table to celebrate looked nothing like the family that had once split time between a break room and a stairwell. Marisol, the school nurse, came, older now, retired the previous spring, bringing a homemade cake that she made sure, twice, out loud, contained absolutely no nuts of any kind. Dominic, the pediatric nurse, came too, off duty for once, still wearing the same badge lanyard with Eli's crayon drawing tucked behind his hospital ID. Mr. Ferris came, bringing Eli a second-hand microscope he had found at an estate sale because he remembered, months earlier, Eli mentioning he had never gotten to look through a real one. And Nathaniel came, no longer in a suit, wearing jeans for what Renata joked was possibly the first time in his adult life, carrying a small gift wrapped clumsily, the kind of clumsy wrapping that comes from a person who never had much practice, wrapping presents for a 14-year-old because he had not had the chance to in a very long time. Inside the wrapping paper was a stethoscope, a real one, not a toy, engraved along the metal tubing with 3 small words, "For the drawer." Eli understood immediately. It was not just a gift for a future doctor. It was a quiet acknowledgement between the two of them of the night that had changed both of their lives, the night a shaking hand had finally, with help, reached for something worth saving. That evening, after the guests had gone home and the backyard lights had been switched off one by one, Eli sat outside with Nathaniel for a while, the way they often did now, not saying much, just present with each other, the way people are when a relationship has moved past needing conversation to fill the silence. Nathaniel asked him, the way he sometimes did, what he wanted to be when he grew up, though by now the question felt less like small talk and more like genuine curiosity about a young man he had come to care for deeply. Eli thought about it for a long moment before answering. He said he wanted to be the kind of doctor who teaches kids like he used to be, kids who show up to appointments a little too watchful, a little too quiet, kids who have learned to read rooms and read labels and read fear on adult faces because nobody ever had the time to just sit down and explain things to them properly. He wanted to be Marisol at recess. He wanted to be Dominic staying 20 minutes late. He wanted, more than anything, to make sure that no other 10-year-old ever had to guess, in the worst moment of his life, whether he was remembering the protocol correctly. Nathaniel did not say much in response. He did not need to. He simply nodded, looked out at the yard for a while, and eventually said that Theo would have liked him. It was the first time he had said his son's name out loud in front of Eli without his voice catching, and both of them understood, without needing to discuss it, that this was its own kind of quiet, hard-won progress. Never underestimate a child who pays close attention when the adults around him are too tired to. Never assume that fear and preparation cannot exist in the same small chest at the same time. Never forget that a shaking hand, guided by someone who refuses to give up, can still do the exact right thing at the exact right moment. Never assume that a person in an expensive suit has nothing broken inside them, and never assume that a child in a worn hoodie has nothing whole and steady to offer. And never forget that the knowledge which saves a life sometimes begins with a nurse who chooses to sit down instead of walking away, a teacher who notices a lonely lunch table, and a boy brave enough to say, quietly, "Sir, my little brother can't breathe," and to stay until someone listens. If this story moved you, please like this video. Leave a comment telling us which part stayed with you the longest, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that showing up for each other still matters. Subscribe for more stories about courage, quiet strength, and the small, ordinary decisions that end up changing everything. Because sometimes the bravest person in the room is the smallest one in it, and sometimes the strongest hands are the ones that are shaking the most right before they finally reach for something worth saving.